In 1984, John Adams had a dream that went a little something like this.
10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Well, in the actual dream, it was over the Oakland Bay Bridge in San Francisco, and it was an oil tanker that was floating on the river that abruptly turned upright and took off into the sky. For 3 years, John Adams had been serving as the composer in residence for the San Francisco Symphony. His final compositional deadline was approaching quickly, and he had to produce something, and so what he produced was the 3-movement gigantic piece called Harmonielehre. Harmonielehre is the culmination of John Adams' first period, and it crystallizes what we would now call his signature style. There's so much to talk about with this piece, but I'm going to argue that this piece is John Adams' response to the work of Arnold Schoenberg. There's 3 aspects to that response. First, Adams makes a strong case for tonality. Second, there's an obvious critique of Schoenberg, and then third, there's a subtle critique of Schoenberg that involves musical quotes. But first, here's a little background between John Adams and his relationship with Arnold Schoenberg. A decade before John Adams wrote Harmonielehre, he was graduating from Harvard with both a bachelor's and master's in composition. He studied with Leon Kirchner and Earl Kim, who were both composers who studied with Schoenberg when Schoenberg was teaching in Los Angeles at UCLA. It was here at Harvard where Adams got his first real contact with Schoenberg's dodecaphonic music. John Adams even played clarinet in the American premiere of Schoenberg's opera Moses and Aaron. John Adams' initial reaction to Schoenberg's music was not so positive.
And I had no interest in that. I had no interest in atonal music or serialism, which was very, very de rigueur in those days.
John Adams is a composer who is keenly aware of music history. In the book, The John Adams Reader, Adams says, "Schoenberg was a major figure for me. I think I was drawn to him partly just because he was so prickly." The fullest summation of John Adams' feelings on Schoenberg that I have found is on the webpage for Harmonielehre, where John Adams writes the following. "But Schoenberg also represented to me something twisted and contorted. He was the first composer to assume the role of high priest, a creative mind whose entire life ran unfailingly against the grain of society, almost as if he had chosen the role of irritant. Despite my respect for, and even intimidation by the persona of Schoenberg, I felt it only honest to acknowledge that I profoundly disliked the sound of 12-tone music. His aesthetic to me was an over-ripening of 19th century individualism, one in which the composer was a god of sorts, to which the listener would come as if to a sacramental altar. It was with Schoenberg that the agony of modern music had been born, and it was no secret that the audience for classical music during the 20th century was rapidly shrinking, in no small part because of the aural ugliness of so much of the new work being written." Out of Schoenberg's serialism, John Adams saw a compositional split in 2 directions. The first was towards total and complete serialism, which was spearheaded by Pierre Boulez. And the second was the free aleatoric music of John Cage. Again from the John Adams Reader, Adams, quote, "opted to follow Cage because I thought that he at least was genuinely American and utterly original. Boulez seemed to me very aggressive and exclusive." All of these thoughts and discoveries for Schoenberg and his music were happening for Adams when he was on campus in Harvard in the 1970s. He felt some cognitive dissonance during this time that he describes in his autobiography, Hallelujah Junction. Quote, "Imagine me, if you will, an aspiring composer, sitting in a classroom diligently counting backward from 12, tracing down combinatorial transformations, and trying to get a rush from a 3-minute setting of a poem by George Trakl or Stefan George. Then imagine this same student emerging from his somber seminar, walking across the campus, and hearing from some dorm window the screaming, slashing, bending, soaring, lawless guitar of Jimi Hendrix. Before we dive into my arguments here, talking about music is cheap. If you haven't listened to this piece, I would highly recommend it. The seminal recording is Edo de Vart's premiere recording with the San Francisco Symphony. Point 1. A case for tonality. Harmonielehre is John Adams' case for tonal music. This piece has many of the familiar features that we associate with big romantic symphonies. 1. It's got 3 movements in a fast-slow-fast pattern. 2, it's got a massive instrumentation for the orchestra. 3, there's a big, strong opening to the piece. Those opening 18 measures are firmly rooted in the key of E minor. Throughout this whole piece, Adams' harmony moves fluently through different harmonies and textures and occasionally juxtaposes two keys with each other. Now, this is not tonal in the sense of a Beethoven symphony, but this is also strictly not serial. There's nothing serialized about John Adams' compositional process in this whole piece. The harmonic structure of the piece is much more in line with early 20th century romanticists like Mahler than it is with like Schoenberg. The fact that there is a harmonic structure firmly roots it in the same vein as Beethoven and Mahler. Point 2, poking fun at Schoenberg. Although Adams has never explicitly said so, I think there's multiple points in this piece where John Adams is poking fun at Schoenberg. To understand some of the jabs, we first need to talk about the connection that John Adams makes to Schoenberg. The first and most obvious connection to Schoenberg is the title of the piece itself, Harmonielehre. Harmonielehre roughly translates to the study of harmony. Composers such as Hugo Riemann, Heinrich Schenker, and most notably Arnold Schoenberg have all written treatises that were titled Harmonielehre. Schoenberg's textbook Harmonielehre was written in 1911, which is significant because that is the year that Schoenberg was really starting to abandon the tonality that he was writing about in this textbook. The 12-tone method had not been codified at this point, but Schoenberg's mind was definitely going that direction. Pieces like Pierrot Lunaire are only 2 years away from being written. When music students are really first introduced to Schoenberg, they're often introduced to Schoenberg in relation to his work with serialism. This is understandable because that's one of his most significant contributions to Western art music, but Schoenberg was perfectly capable of writing in this romantic style. His 1910 piece Gurrelieder is a fantastic example of this. Gurrelieder is a Strauss tone poem on steroids. It's hyper-romantic. In Gurrelieder, there's also the first few examples of Sprechstimme, which later became popularized by Pierrot Lunaire. Michael Steinberg, who was the former program notes writer for the San Francisco Symphony, visited John Adams while he was writing Harmonielehre, and recalled, quote, "A well-worn score of Gurrelieder, the great and magical cantata that Schoenberg completed in 1911, occupied a conspicuous place on the shelf by the tail of his grand piano." On John Adams' website, earbox.com, which honestly is one of the best composer websites that I've ever seen, he mentioned specifically that Gurrelieder was one of the pieces that inspired him while he was writing Harmonielehre. I think it's ironic that out of all the possible pieces that John Adams says that he can be inspired by, he chooses one of Schoenberg's most tonal in Gurrelieder. Gurrelieder is a lengthy piece, it's written for a large romantic orchestra, in a late romantic style, and that happens to be Schoenberg's most major tonal work. Many people consider Schoenberg's invention of serialism to be his greatest contribution to the musical world, but that's not what John Adams chooses to recognize specifically with Schoenberg. By using this style of harmony, or harmony at all for that matter, John Adams is affirming what he thinks Schoenberg got right. Adams was obviously aware of the title's translation, but he states, quote, "I'm not trying to teach anyone harmony. This is the culmination, so far, of my teaching myself about harmony." I think there's an inherent irony of John Adams naming his work Harmonielehre, the title of a textbook from the most famous serialist of all time, and that textbook discusses tonal harmony. The next point in this first section is the opening measures of this piece. I had an old theory professor that told me, don't overlook the obvious. These first 18 measures pretty firmly establish the key of what this piece is in. And this key comes back throughout because, like I said before, there is a harmonic structure to the whole piece, and these chords appear back at the very end of the third movement. For 30 seconds, this is the only chord that is heard, and it's stated in such a powerful way that it leaves an aural imprint for the listener, so that when it comes back through the piece, the listener can orient themselves. Adams firmly stated his belief in harmony from another quote from Hallelujah Junction. In 1976, while still in the process of forming my own voice, I'd had that critical encounter with Wagner, an ear-opening experience that reminded me in vivid terms of the power of tonal harmony, both as an expressive tool and as a means of achieving structural coherence. The expressive potential was obvious, but tonality also gave the composer the ability to create large, unified architectural forms whose balanced internal tensions, like the beams and supports of a grand cathedral, made possible musical statements that were both varied and unified. Thinking about things historically, I began to confirm a suspicion that I'd had for a very long time, that atonality, rather than enriching the expressive palette of the composer, in fact did just the opposite. When I surveyed the music of other cultures, both geographically and historically, nowhere could I find a coherent, meaningful musical system that wasn't tonal at its root. Point 3. Musical quotes. John Adams has stated publicly that there's a few musical quotes in Harmonielehre. One of the musical quotes that he mentions is from Sibelius' Fourth Symphony. And in this musical quote, he's talking specifically about the second movement, where he's using muted cello and just that overall darker feeling. It's interesting to me that he quotes Sibelius, and especially his Fourth Symphony, because the Fourth Symphony was also written in the year 1911, which keeps popping up everywhere. Sibelius, like John Adams, rejected the tenets of the Second Viennese school and thought that extreme depth of emotions could be achieved by writing tonally. The other and more interesting quote that John Adams says he uses in this piece is a quote from Mahler's 10th Symphony, and this quote also appears in John Adams' second movement of Harmonielehre. Now, the entirety of the Second Viennese school was enamored with the music of Gustav Mahler. For them, he was a real leading figure in where music was going. They saw in him someone who was expanding the form and tonality of music further than anyone else had done it before. To honor Mahler's influence on Schoenberg, Schoenberg dedicated Harmonielehre to, quote, the hallowed memory of Gustav Mahler, who had died earlier that year in the year 1911. So this quote in Harmonielehre shows up in bars 149 through 155, where John Adams builds up an extremely dissonant chord and the trumpets hold a high B over the orchestral texture. Mahler had begun his 10th Symphony in the year 1910, but by the time he died in 1911, it was unfinished. Towards the end of Mahler's life, he was moving away from more traditional harmonies. If you think to the 9th Symphony, it's not really tonal. It's very modal. There's not 5/1 cadences. And the same is true for the opening movement of the 10th Symphony. The opening movement of the 10th Symphony is an adagio, and that was the only movement that Mahler had fully written out and orchestrated. I love Boulez's conducting. He's conducting one of the most dissonant chords ever in music to me, and he's so stoic in playing with it. This moment comes in bars 203 to 213, and it's remarkable because it's the most dissonant thing that Mahler had ever written, but it's still functional. This is a dominant chord that contains the pitches flat 2, diatonic 2, 3, sharp 4, diatonic 5, flat 6, natural 7, and a sharp 7. It's only 3 pitches shy of a complete chromatic scale, only missing the notes E, F sharp, and B flat. In the Mahler quote, the note held over by the trumpets is an A, and in the Adams it's a B. Here's the quote in the original Mahler. And here's the quote by Adams. Now, John Adams, again, who's keenly aware of history, was, to my mind, fully aware that he was quoting Mahler, a tonal composer, at his most dissonant point. And he quoted Schoenberg, a famous serial composer, at his most tonal. I think what Adams' point in all of this is that he's showing that there's a correct way to handle extreme dissonances, and he doesn't agree with the way that Schoenberg ended up handling those dissonances. So in summary, I think this piece, John Adams is struggling with the legacy of Schoenberg, and this is his musical response to the life and work of Schoenberg. Adams finds faults with the 12-tone method, and so he's trying to show that there can still be power in music written in this hyper-romantic form. Because this piece definitely harkens back to those early 20th century symphonists. And certainly John Adams has found success with this because he's the most performed living composer. He has performances all over with major orchestras, conducting his own music, conducting other music, and just everyone playing his music. So let me know what you think about this piece. I mean, I really love this piece, and there's so much to talk about it, but I find the Schoenberg angle the most fascinating. So if you're interested, subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll respond to all your comments. I'm just interested to know what others think about this piece.